Before we begin, viewer discretion is advised. This case involves the deaths of 2 children, domestic homicide, and suicide. All information presented in this video is based on official findings, public records, and credible reporting available at the time of production. A babysitter noticed something wasn't right. At first, it didn't seem like an emergency. Families get busy. People miss calls. Text messages go unanswered all the time. But this felt different. Hours had passed, and nobody had heard from the Mitchell family. Calls went unanswered. Texts went unanswered. The silence kept growing. A concerned family member felt the same way. Something wasn't right. Together, they made a decision that would set off a chain of events nobody could have imagined. They called police and requested a welfare check. Officers arrived at a multi-million-dollar home in Houston's River Oaks neighborhood, one of the most affluent communities in the city. From the outside, everything looked normal. Inside, investigators found 4 members of the same family dead: a husband, a wife, 2 young children. Within hours, investigators would reach a conclusion about what happened inside that house. But for many people who knew the family, the conclusion only created a bigger question. Because this wasn't a family that appeared to be in crisis. There were no public warning signs, no recent police calls, no highly publicized disputes, no indication, at least from the outside, that anything was seriously wrong. And that's what makes this case so difficult to understand. Not just what happened inside that house, but how a family that seemed to have everything could end up at the center of one of Houston's most shocking tragedies. This is the case of Matthew and Thai Mitchell. To understand why this case resonated with so many people, it's important to understand who the Mitchell family was before tragedy entered the picture. Because long before headlines and police reports, they were known for something else entirely. They were known as a success story. At the center of that story was Thai Mitchell. Friends and colleagues described her as ambitious, creative, and deeply involved in both her professional and personal life. Thai was a first-generation Vietnamese American who grew up around the restaurant industry. Her family owned restaurants, and from an early age she was exposed to the realities of running a business, serving customers, and building something from the ground up. But restaurants weren't her only focus. She earned a degree from the University of Houston and later completed graduate studies. Over the years, she built a successful career in human resources, eventually holding leadership positions while balancing several other ventures. Those who knew her often spoke about her ability to manage multiple responsibilities at once. She was a businesswoman, an entrepreneur, a mother, and someone who seemed constantly focused on her next goal. Alongside her professional career, Thai also launched a fashion brand called Foreign Fair, a project that reflected both her creativity and her cultural background. But perhaps the venture she became most publicly associated with was the restaurant business she built alongside her husband. Traveler's Table quickly became one of Houston's most recognized restaurants. The concept was simple but unique. The menu drew inspiration from different cultures and cuisines around the world, reflecting the couple's shared passion for travel, food, and hospitality. The restaurant earned praise from customers, attention from local media, and a reputation as one of Houston's most popular dining destinations. For many people, Traveler's Table represented more than a successful business. It represented the life the Mitchells had built together. And then there were the children, Maya and Maxwell. Friends and family described them as bright, energetic, and deeply loved. Much of the family's social media presence reflected ordinary moments many parents would recognize: school activities, family outings, vacations, birthdays, the kinds of memories families create every day. And from the outside, there was every reason to believe many more memories were still ahead of them. Matthew Mitchell appeared equally accomplished. Before entering the restaurant industry, he worked as a journalist and later built a career in the pharmaceutical field. He studied at Oxford and eventually attended culinary school before helping launch the restaurant ventures that would become central to the family's public identity. Together, Matthew and Thai appeared to have achieved what many people spend their lives working toward: a successful business, a growing reputation, a family, a future. And that's what makes this case so difficult to understand, because when investigators later began piecing together what happened inside that River Oaks home, they found themselves confronting the same question everyone else was asking. From the outside, this looked like a success story. So where does a story like this begin to unravel? By the spring of 2026, the Mitchells weren't just maintaining the life they had built. They were expanding it. Traveler's Table had become one of Houston's most recognizable restaurants, attracting both locals and visitors, with a menu inspired by cuisines from around the world. What started as an idea had grown into a successful business and a well-known name in the city's restaurant scene. But the couple wasn't content to stop there. Over the years, they continued exploring new concepts and opportunities, including Traveler's Cart, another venture that reflected their passion for food and hospitality. As their profile grew, so did public recognition. The restaurants received industry praise, earned positive reviews, and helped establish the Mitchells as respected figures within Houston's hospitality community. Their success even brought national attention. The couple appeared on television programs and food-focused media platforms, introducing their story and their restaurants to audiences far beyond Texas. To many people, they represented a modern entrepreneurial success story. Two ambitious people, building businesses, raising a family, and creating opportunities together. And publicly, there was little reason to think otherwise. Their social media accounts painted a familiar picture: family dinners, travel, celebrations, photos with friends, moments from the restaurants, the kinds of posts millions of families share every day. Nothing appeared out of place. If anything, the future seemed busy and promising. According to those close to the family, there were plans on the horizon, business goals still being discussed, events still being scheduled, commitments still being made. Just days before the tragedy, Thai had reportedly been helping Maya prepare for an upcoming family wedding in Boston. It was the kind of ordinary moment that barely stands out at the time. A mother helping her daughter pick out clothes for a future event, a family making plans, looking ahead, assuming there would be more time. Even in the final days, there were dinners planned, conversations scheduled, responsibilities waiting to be handled. Nothing suggested those plans would never happen. And that's one of the details that continues to stay with people who knew them. Because when investigators later reconstructed the timeline, they didn't find a family preparing for an ending. They found a family preparing for the future. And that's exactly why what happened next felt impossible. As investigators began reconstructing the Mitchell family's final days, they worked to establish a simple timeline. Where had family members been? Who had they spoken with? And were there any indications that something was wrong? Based on publicly available reporting and information gathered after the deaths, the answers were not immediately clear. In fact, one of the most striking aspects of the timeline is how ordinary much of it appeared. On April 24th, Thai Mitchell posted a video to social media featuring herself and Matthew. The video showed the couple sharing a lighthearted moment and joking about growing old together. At the time, there was nothing unusual about the post. It appeared consistent with the type of content the family had shared before. Only after the tragedy did people begin revisiting it, not because it contained obvious clues, but because it documented a family interaction that occurred just days before the deaths. As April turned into May, daily life appeared to continue. The family's restaurant businesses remained open. Employees continued working. Customers continued visiting. Business operations appeared to be moving forward as normal. At the same time, family plans remained active. According to reporting published after the deaths, Thea had recently spent time helping her daughter Maya prepare for an upcoming family wedding in Boston. The outing included shopping for clothing they intended to wear to the event. Investigators often pay attention to details like these when reconstructing timelines, not because they explain motive, but because they help establish state of mind and future planning. In this case, the wedding plans became one of several details that stood out to people trying to understand what happened. The family was making commitments, scheduling events, planning for the weeks ahead. Friends and acquaintances who later spoke publicly about their interactions with Thai described recent conversations as normal. No major concerns were reported. No public disputes were identified. No immediate crisis was apparent to those speaking after the tragedy. That does not mean investigators concluded there were no problems. It simply means that people close to the family did not publicly identify obvious warning signs in the days leading up to May 4th. As investigators continued building the timeline, attention turned to the weekend before the welfare check. This is where the available information becomes more limited. Public reporting established that communication with members of the family eventually stopped. Calls went unanswered. Messages were not returned. At first, there was little reason to assume anything was wrong. Families become busy. People miss calls. Schedules change. But as time passed, concern began to grow among those attempting to contact them. And that concern would become the first indication that something was seriously wrong. Because by the afternoon of May 4th, people close to the family were no longer asking why messages hadn't been returned. They were asking whether the family was safe. That concern ultimately led to a welfare check request. And within hours, investigators would find themselves at the center of one of the most devastating cases Houston had seen in years. By May 4th, concern about the Mitchell family had grown beyond a missed phone call. Multiple attempts to reach family members had gone unanswered. For those closest to them, that was unusual. According to reporting on the case, one of the first people to become concerned was the family's babysitter. A relative was also unable to make contact. As the day continued, the lack of communication became increasingly difficult to explain. Eventually, a decision was made to request a welfare check. For law enforcement, welfare checks are routine. Most do not lead to criminal investigations. Officers are often asked to check on individuals when family members, friends, or caregivers are unable to reach them. In many cases, there is a simple explanation. But on the afternoon of May 4th, this welfare check would be different. At approximately 5:30 p.m., Houston police officers arrived at the family's home on Kingston Street in River Oaks. What began as a welfare check quickly became a death investigation. Inside the residence, officers found 4 members of the Mitchell family deceased: Matthew Mitchell, Thy Mitchell, their daughter Maya, and their son Maxwell. News of the discovery spread quickly throughout Houston's restaurant community and among those who knew the family. For many, the information was difficult to process. Just days earlier, the family had been running businesses, making plans, and going about daily life. Now investigators were faced with the task of determining exactly what had happened inside the home. The scene was secured. Evidence was collected. Investigators began reconstructing the family's final hours. As that process moved forward, authorities were able to establish the basic sequence of events relatively quickly. According to investigators, Thy Mitchell had been killed. Investigators also determined that Maya and Maxwell had been killed. Matthew Mitchell was found deceased from what authorities concluded was a self-inflicted gunshot wound. From an investigative standpoint, those findings answered the most immediate question: what happened inside the home? But they did little to answer the question that followed: why? Because as information about the family became public, investigators encountered a challenge that would continue throughout the case. There were no publicly documented domestic violence incidents, no publicly known restraining orders, no obvious event that immediately explained the tragedy. Instead, investigators found themselves examining a family that, at least from the outside, appeared to be functioning normally. And that reality would shape much of the discussion that followed. The question was no longer what happened inside the Mitchell home. The question was whether anyone could explain why it happened. With investigators having established what happened inside the Mitchell home, attention quickly turned to the question that remained unanswered: why? In many homicide investigations, detectives begin looking for indicators that help explain motive: past conflicts, financial disputes, domestic violence reports, criminal history, relationship issues, or significant life events that may have contributed to a crisis. In the Mitchell case, investigators faced a challenge. Many of the factors commonly associated with domestic homicide cases were not immediately apparent. There were no publicly reported domestic violence incidents involving the family, no publicly known restraining orders, no publicly documented history of violent criminal behavior. And according to many of those who knew the family, there had been no obvious warning signs that something this serious was about to happen. That absence of clear answers became one of the defining aspects of the case. Friends, customers, employees, and members of Houston's restaurant community struggled to understand how such a tragedy could occur without anyone recognizing that something was wrong. As reporting on the case continued, questions emerged about the family's financial situation. Like many businesses in the hospitality industry, restaurants operate under constant pressure. Food costs fluctuate, labor costs increase, competition remains intense. Even successful restaurants can face significant financial challenges behind the scenes. Public reporting indicated that some of the Mitchell family's business ventures were carrying debt and facing financial pressures. That information quickly became part of the public discussion surrounding the case. But investigators never publicly concluded that financial issues were the cause of the killings. And that's an important distinction. Financial stress may help explain circumstances. It does not automatically explain motive. Authorities did not publicly identify evidence showing that business debt directly led to what happened inside the home. As investigators continued examining the family's recent history, attention also turned toward Matthew Mitchell's mental state. Following the tragedy, reports emerged suggesting that people close to the situation had concerns about his behavior in the months leading up to the deaths. Some reports referenced allegations of increasing paranoia. Others described behavior that, in hindsight, appeared unusual. However, many of those accounts surfaced after the tragedy and were not presented by investigators as definitive explanations. Authorities did not publicly announce a specific motive, nor did they identify a single event that clearly triggered the violence. That left investigators, reporters, and the public facing an uncomfortable reality. Sometimes an investigation can establish exactly what happened without ever fully explaining why it happened. And for many people following this case, that uncertainty became one of the most difficult aspects to accept, because the available information seemed to point in two different directions. On one hand, investigators had established a clear sequence of events. On the other, the picture leading up to those events remained incomplete. The family was making future plans. Businesses were operating. Daily life appeared to continue. Yet something was happening beneath the surface that those on the outside either could not see or did not fully understand. Mental health professionals often note that serious psychological struggles are not always visible to friends, coworkers, or even family members. That does not mean warning signs never existed, only that they may not have been recognized for what they were at the time. Whether that was the case here remains difficult to determine. What is clear is that investigators never publicly identified the kind of straightforward motive many people expected. And as the investigation progressed, one question continued to remain at the center of the case. Can a person experience a catastrophic psychological or emotional crisis without the people closest to them fully recognizing what is happening? For many people trying to understand the Mitchell case, that question remains unanswered. By this point in the investigation, authorities had established what happened inside the Mitchell home, but many of the questions people were asking had no clear answer. Why did this happen? Could it have been prevented? Were there warning signs that people missed? And perhaps most importantly, was there anything that could have changed the outcome? Those questions continue to surround the case. Not because investigators failed to do their job, but because some tragedies leave behind uncertainty that no investigation can fully eliminate. One of the reasons this case attracted so much attention is that it challenged a common assumption. Many people believe that before a tragedy occurs, there are always obvious warning signs. A history of violence, repeated police involvement, threats, escalating conflicts. Some indication that something is wrong. But investigators did not publicly identify those kinds of indicators here. That does not mean problems did not exist. It simply means they were not visible in ways that were immediately recognized by the people around them. And that's an important distinction, because the absence of obvious warning signs is not the same thing as evidence that everything is fine. Mental health professionals, crisis intervention specialists, and law enforcement investigators have long noted that personal crises do not always unfold in public view. Sometimes family members recognize changes immediately. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes the signs only seem obvious after people begin looking back at events through the lens of what eventually happened. That's one reason hindsight can be misleading. When people know the outcome, they naturally begin searching for clues. They revisit conversations, social media posts, decisions, small details that once seemed ordinary. But hindsight creates information that people did not have at the time. And that's why many cases appear clearer after the fact than they actually were while they were unfolding. The Mitchell case is a reminder of that reality. Many of the details that now attract attention appeared completely ordinary when they occurred. The social media posts, the wedding plans, the daily routines, the restaurant operations. None of those things immediately suggested the tragedy that investigators would later uncover. But there is one decision in this case that continues to stand out: the decision to request a welfare check. The concern started with something simple: People who normally heard from the family could no longer reach them. Calls went unanswered. Messages went unanswered. Communication stopped. For some people, that might not seem unusual. Life gets busy. Schedules change. People forget to return calls. But in this case, the babysitter and family members trusted their instincts. Something felt different. Something felt wrong. So they acted. That decision ultimately led to the discovery inside the home. It did not change the outcome, but it ensured that the situation was identified quickly and that authorities could begin determining what had happened. And in many ways, that may be one of the most important lessons from the entire case. Trusting your instincts is not the same thing as overreacting. Sometimes concern is justified. Sometimes making the phone call matters. Sometimes checking on someone matters. No single lesson can fully explain a tragedy like this, and no reflection can provide answers that investigators themselves were unable to find. But cases like this often remind people of something important. Relationships matter. Community matters. Paying attention matters. And reaching out when something feels wrong matters. Because while investigators were ultimately able to explain what happened inside the Mitchell home, the deeper questions surrounding why it happened may never be answered completely. And that uncertainty is part of what continues to make this case so difficult for many people to understand. As investigators completed their work, some questions remained unanswered. The official findings established what happened inside the Mitchell home. But for many people who knew the family, the focus eventually shifted away from the investigation itself. Instead, attention turned to the lives that had been lost. Before the tragedy, Thai Mitchell had become a well-known figure within Houston's restaurant community. As a first-generation Vietnamese-American entrepreneur, she helped build businesses that introduced customers to new cuisines, cultures, and experiences. Friends and colleagues described someone who was ambitious, creative, and deeply invested in the projects she pursued. Whether through her restaurants, her fashion brand, or her work in human resources, she built a reputation as someone constantly working toward the next goal. That drive became a recurring theme in the tributes that followed. People remembered her as a business owner, a colleague, a mentor, a friend, most importantly, a mother. For those closest to the family, the loss of Maya and Maxwell was equally difficult to comprehend. Both children were remembered by family members and loved ones as young lives filled with potential and possibility. And like so many cases involving children, the tragedy was measured not only by what was lost, but by what never had the chance to happen. Future birthdays, graduations, careers, families of their own, milestones that should have been years away. In the days and weeks following the deaths, tributes appeared across social media and throughout Houston's restaurant industry. Customers shared memories, friends expressed condolences. Business owners and restaurant workers reflected on the impact the family had made within the community. For many people, the Mitchell family was more than a headline. They were people they had worked alongside, people they had supported, people they had known personally. Community gatherings and memorials provided an opportunity for friends, employees, and supporters to honor the victims and support one another. And while no gathering could answer the questions left behind by the case, they served as a reminder of how many lives the family had touched. The response from the restaurant community was particularly significant. Restaurants are often described as families of their own. Employees work long hours together. Owners invest years building relationships with staff and customers. When tragedy strikes, those connections become impossible to ignore. At Traveler's Table, operations eventually continued. Customers returned. Meals continued to be served. Employees continued showing up to work, not because anyone had forgotten what happened, but because the people who remained were determined to preserve what had been built. In many ways, that may be one of the most lasting parts of Thai Mitchell's legacy. The businesses continue, the memories remain, and the impact she had on the people around her continues long after the headlines faded. Some cases leave investigators searching for answers. Others leave communities searching for meaning. This case leaves both. More than anything, the Mitchell case remains a reminder that lives cannot be reduced to the worst thing that happened to them. The investigation is part of the story, but it is not the entire story. The entire story includes a mother, 2 children, a family, a community, and countless people whose lives were affected by their loss. Today, the questions surrounding the case remain. Some may never be answered completely. But for those who knew and loved Maya and Maxwell, their memories extend far beyond the circumstances of their deaths. They are remembered through the people they impacted, the relationships they built, and the community they helped create. And that may be the most important legacy of all. Thank you for watching. If you have thoughts on this case, feel free to share them respectfully in the comments below. And if you or someone you know is experiencing a mental health crisis, support resources are available. Reaching out for help can make a difference.